China has been the world's greatest economic miracle of recent history. In the space of less than 50 years, it has gone from being an economic backwater to being the manufacturing hub of the world's second largest economy behind only the US, and a major hub of international trade. China's middle class has boomed. High-speed trains crisscross the land. Cities of millions of people have popped up seemingly out of nowhere. By all accounts, China is an unstoppable juggernaut. But what if much of that economic boom was an illusion? What if those stunning GDP growth numbers were actually a fraud? It seems improbable, but recent research has suggested that this is exactly the case. And in fact, China's economy may be 60% smaller than what the country claims it is. So how could China fake its economic data? Why would it do that? And what does it mean for the country's future? In this video, we'll answer these questions. But before we begin, be sure to subscribe to our channel for notifications on our latest news and analysis. And if you like this video, hit the like button and help us spread the word. China's time as an insular, hardcore communist country came to an end in 1976 with the death of its longtime ruler, Mao Zedong. Beginning in 1978, the country's new president, Deng Xiaoping, began a series of reforms to bring wealth to China through trade with free market economies. China still calls itself communist today, and it's still led by the Chinese Communist Party, but this so-called communism is unrecognizable from what it once was. Today, China has profit-making private businesses large and small, billionaires galore, and stock markets with thousands of listed companies and millions of investors. This isn't your grandfather's communism. But as impressive as this change has been, evidence is beginning to emerge that at least some of China's economic growth has been faked, and the country's economy might not be nearly as big as the Chinese Communist Party claims. To understand how this happened, we have to understand first how the size of an economy is measured, and how measuring the size of the economy in China differs from how it's done in other countries. Economies are measured by GDP, or gross domestic product. That number is determined by adding up different components of an economy. To get a country's GDP, you add up the country's spending on consumption, plus its government spending, plus its investment, and finally, its net exports. Net exports are exports minus imports. If you have more exports than imports, as in the case of Germany, that adds to GDP. If you have more imports than exports, as is the case with the United States, you get a negative number that subtracts from GDP. The US has had a negative net exports number for decades, but it hasn't been much of a problem because all of the positive numbers in consumption, government spending, and investment. In any case, this is the formula for GDP. Now, in democratic countries like the US or Britain, there are arm's-length government agencies that calculate and track GDP. Arm's length means that under the law, these agencies are independent of the politicians who run the government. For instance, the US has the Bureau of Economic Analysis, or BEA, which is responsible for reporting monthly, quarterly, and annual GDP numbers. In Great Britain, there is the Office for National Statistics, or ONS, and the ONS has an independent regulator called the Office for Statistics Regulation. Now, just having all these arm's-length agencies doesn't guarantee that the numbers are always reliable. Sometimes those agencies might be run by people who are backers of the current government, and they might fudge the numbers a little to make the economy look better than it is, in order to keep that government popular. Or maybe it's run by someone who opposes the current government, and they might fudge the numbers a little to make the economy look worse and increase that government's chances of losing the election. But because there is oversight, and because the people within those agencies have all sorts of different political beliefs, it's generally not possible to truly fake those numbers, at least not for long. But that's not the case in China. In China, GDP numbers are tracked and reported by local governments in the country's many various provinces. They report those numbers to the central government in Beijing, which reports the numbers publicly. But there's something else going on. The central government in Beijing sets economic growth targets for the provinces, and they make the local governments responsible for hitting those targets. So in other words, the same entities that are publicly responsible for making the economy grow are also the entities that report those numbers. You can probably see what the flaw might be with a system like this. Making things worse is the fact that in China, regional governors who fail to meet economic growth targets can be disciplined, including being dismissed from their job. At times, head of local governments have even been executed. In other words, these people who are in charge of both growing the economy and reporting on the economy have a lot of incentive to make things look good. And they have been making things look very good. China's economic growth since the beginning of the 21st century has been remarkably stable. Economies tend to grow in waves, with periods of rapid growth, periods of slow growth, and recessionary periods when the economy shrinks. But since the late 1990s, China's economy has been incredibly stable in its growth, with GDP expansion coming in at between 7% and 10% in most years. The last time the country recorded a year of negative GDP growth was 1976. Coincidentally or not, that was the last year that Mao was still in charge of the country. So if you're in charge of a Chinese local government and your economy isn't doing so well, how do you make things look good and avoid getting fired, or worse, by Beijing? Well, let's go back to those components of GDP. There's not much you can do about the consumption numbers or the investment numbers, and you can't really fake foreign trade numbers because other nations are involved. But you do have total control over the government spending portion of GDP. Now here's where it gets a little tricky. Local Chinese governments aren't allowed to borrow money, and tax revenue goes straight to the central government in Beijing. So where do you get the money for government spending? You set up what's known as a local government financing vehicle, or LGFV. These LGFVs are able to issue bonds. That is, unlike local governments themselves, they can borrow money, and they can use that borrowed money to build infrastructure or huge amounts of housing or set up industrial parks or do anything else that counts as spending. And then that spending counts as part of GDP. It's a pretty good system if you're a provincial governor looking for a promotion to the central government in Beijing, but as a way of building the economy, it's not so great. For instance, one year you might build a highway from a small town to the big city, allowing people to commute to work in the city and improving the economy of the small town. That's a good thing, but the next year, in order to grow your GDP numbers some more, maybe you build another highway to the city. And this new highway is totally redundant, but hey, your GDP numbers look good, and it sure makes for some impressive new freeway infrastructure. But of course, it's wasted money. Wasted, borrowed money. This pretty much explains those gigantic Chinese ghost cities that have become famous over the past 15 years. Entire huge neighborhoods of high-rise buildings that turn out to have no one living in them, and eventually, many end up getting torn down. So what if the local government wasted tons of money investing in the development corporations that built those buildings? They were still added to your GDP numbers. On paper, it looks like your local economy is booming, even if all you did was waste a bunch of cash, material, and labor. No one is exactly sure just how much money local governments have borrowed through these LGFVs, but a recent estimate placed it at the equivalent of $9 trillion US. So how much of China's so-called economic growth was actually faked this way? A few years ago, Luis Martinez, an assistant professor at the University of Chicago, decided he would try to find out whether authoritarian governments are faking their economic numbers. Doing that while not relying on these governments' data is difficult, so Martinez came up with a novel idea. He analyzed the brightness of nighttime lights as seen from orbital satellites. There's a strange correlation between the size of an economy and the energy that it uses, and nighttime lights are one way of measuring how much energy an economy is using. Based on this, he found that authoritarian governments overstate economic growth by 35% on average, and for China specifically, he found that GDP numbers were overstated by about a third. Between 1992 and 2021, China claimed GDP growth of between 8 and 14%, but Martinez's analysis concluded that China's actual growth was between 2 and 6%. Still, the question remains, if China is overstating its GDP by a third year after year, what's the cumulative effect? How much smaller is China's economy today than the government claims it is? The answer to that question came from Yuri Schosfert, a lecturer at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands. He crunched Martinez's numbers to find out just how much of an impact the overstating of GDP would have over time, and concluded that China's economy is likely only 40% the size that the government claims it is. In other words, it's 60% smaller than the official figures. For several years, economists have been saying that China is about to match the US economy in size. In fact, that's what the official data shows. But if the numbers from Martinez and Schosfert are right, then China's economy is only 1/3 the size of the US's. Rather than having an economy that creates $19.5 trillion of output per year, China's economy produces closer to $7.7 trillion per year. Now that is still still big enough for China to keep it standing as the second largest economy in the world. The third largest, Japan, has an output of just 4.4 trillion. But if China's economy is that much smaller than we realized, this has serious implications, and the biggest one is for the debt that China is carrying. Take, for example, the $9 trillion in debt that local governments in China have taken out through their LGFVs. Paying off that debt is one thing if China's economy is worth 19.5 trillion, but it's another thing altogether if China's economy is worth 7.7 trillion. Think about it in terms of a household. Let's say you have $50,000 in debt and are earning an income of $100,000 a year. That's a heavy debt, but with a little fiscal discipline, you can pay it off over several years. But what if you have $50,000 in debt and an income of $40,000 a year? Now, paying off that debt is going to be much harder. Depending on your other expenses, you might not actually be able to do it. And in fact, that's what we're seeing today with China's local government financing vehicles. They are in big financial trouble. Just recently, a number of China's largest banks, all of them with links to the CCP, have started bailing out these LGFVs by converting their 10-year loans to 25-year loans, making it easier to pay them off. But that doesn't change the fact that so much of that borrowed money was wasted on useless activities. The faking of China's economy is causing a debt crisis that will be a drag on the country for years to come. And that's just local government debt. There's also the central government's debt, business debt, and consumer debt like car loans and mortgages. All of these will be much harder to pay off if China's economy is 60% smaller than what it's been telling everyone. The risk of a debt crisis in China today looks very high. And it's not like the government in Beijing didn't know about this fraud. In fact, they've known about it the whole time. Back in 2010, WikiLeaks published top-secret U.S. diplomatic cables. In one of those cables, a senior U.S. diplomat reported on a dinner they had with Li Keqiang, the head of a regional communist party in northeast China. Keqiang told the U.S. diplomat that to get an idea of how China's economy is really doing, you should ignore the GDP numbers and look specifically at electricity consumption, rail cargo volume, and bank lending. All the other data, he said, is man-made. Keqiang went on to become the premier of China, serving from 2013 to 2023. So let's take the advice of one of China's most powerful politicians and assume that the country's miraculous economic numbers are actually fraud. If you like this video, hit the like button. It helps us spread the word about our channel. And don't forget to subscribe to get notifications for all our latest news and analysis. In the meantime, check out one of these videos here to learn more. Thanks for watching.